In 2025, the Women's Rights Network Jersey invited Stephanie Davies-Arai to deliver a series of presentations to educators, politicians and the public, addressing the negative impact of gender ideology on women and girls on the island. Despite attempts by activists and government officials to cancel the events, the public meeting took place on Thursday evening, March the 6th. This is the recording of the event. First, let's take a minute to see how we got here. August 2021, Jersey's Education Department, SIPES, issued the Transgender Guidance for Schools. March 2022, the interim CAS review was published, raising alarm about the gender affirmation care model. September 2023, WRN Jersey wrote an open letter to government and all head teachers raising concerns with the guidance. December 2023, WRN Jersey met with the Education Department to raise concerns with the guidance. March 2024, NHS England banned puberty blockers. March 2024, the Tavistock GIDS closed. April 2024, the final report from the CAS review was published. June 2024, WRN Jersey met the Schools Guidance Working Group, advising them to look at the changes in England and the CAS review findings. January 2025, WRN Jersey announced events with Stephanie Davies-Arai planned for March 2025 with educators, government and the public. February 2025, Highlands College cancelled education meeting venue, stating the event's values did not align with those of SIPES. February 2025, a senior SIPES official sent a message to all head teachers advising them not to attend the meeting. February 2025, activists in Jersey attempted to have the public event cancelled. March 2025, new draft guidance presented to government for approval. WRN Jersey has not been permitted to see it, but we have heard it is largely unchanged.
So Stephanie's been doing this for a while. She set up Transgender Trend in 2015, and the organisation calls for evidence-based care for children with gender-related distress and science-based teaching in schools. Stephanie's background is in education and parenting. She worked with parents and provided teacher training for over 20 years. And her expertise is in how we communicate with children, so we should be all right tonight. She is author of the book Communicating with Kids, published in 2015. She was shortlisted for the John Maddox Science Prize in 2019 for her school's guidance on trans-identified children. Is that the one at the back?
Yeah.
That's the one at the back.
The green one.
The green one at the back. And she was awarded the British Empire Medal in the late Queen's Jubilee Birthday Honours List for services to children as Director of Transgender Trend. So I hope you can see from that we've got somebody really impressive to talk to us about this really quite difficult issue. And I'll now hand over to Stephanie. Thank you.
I'm very happy to be here in Jersey. I would like to just do a presentation today about gender identity ideology, what's happened, how it's happened, and just the recent history of it to bring us up to date with, so it gives us more understanding of what's happening now. I hope it will be just simple and informative, and I really want to leave lots of time for your questions afterwards because I'm willing to answer anything. So don't be afraid, just ask me anything. So I came to this and I was very surprised when I first saw stories in newspapers, and it was around 2013, 2014 that stories started appearing in newspapers about little children who were being transitioned in primary schools. And this was very surprising to me because I'd never heard of it before. It was like something had landed that was fully formed and had never been discussed. Nothing had led up to this. And so I looked on all the places I could think of to find information, because normally when there's something new that comes into education or something new that comes into parenting practice or theories about children, it's hotly discussed. People are not afraid to disagree and argue about it and disagree and, you know, say what they feel. But in this area there was nothing. There was absolute radio silence. So that really intrigued me. Why aren't people talking about this new theory about children? Because that, to me, if you can't talk about an issue and debate it openly, that's a safeguarding issue, that it will harm children if adults can't talk about theories that we're applying to them that have very, very significant effects on children's lives. So I thought somebody needs to talk about it, somebody needs to make that debate happen. So that's how I started about 10 years ago. And here I am, very, very happy. This is my first visit to Jersey. So let's go straight in. This is the trend that I'm talking about. The Tavistock Gender Clinic in London opened in 1989. In the past, it had a very small intake. Gender dysphoria, or used to be called gender identity disorder, but gender dysphoria, it's called now, was very, very rare. And suddenly, around 2010, 2011, the numbers started going up. And that coincides with what was happening then, was that the Tavistock Gender Clinic started a puberty blockers trial. So children were enrolled into taking puberty blockers at an earlier age than in the past. Before that time, puberty blockers were given to very, very few children when they turned at age 16. And that was just a very few who had very persistent gender dysphoria from a very early age. So now they were able to give blockers at age 10 or 11 at the start of puberty. So from under 50 referrals a year, the referrals jumped to thousands in a very short space of time, and there are now around 8,000 children on the waiting list for gender clinics. And the number of children who've passed through the Tavistock in that time is estimated to be around 9,000. The Tavistock Clinic was shut down last year after the NHS commissioned an independent review of the service, and it produced its final report in April last year. It was called the CAS review. It was an extensive investigation into medical services for children, and it's the most detailed and comprehensive research document in this area in the world. Nobody's produced a report like this, so it's hugely, hugely important. So not only did the referrals suddenly start rising, but the sex ratio changed. So from majority boys, it became majority girls, driving this huge increase. And this increase in children referred to gender clinics has happened all over the world, throughout Europe, in America, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, it's everywhere, India. And in 2015, this was the really sudden rise. There was an over 100% rise in referrals, so that's continued. And the other change, not only the sex that changed for the majority of children presenting at clinics, but the age. So historically it was boys, and they were in very early childhood before puberty, and suddenly it was girls, and it was when puberty started or during adolescence. So it's predominantly girls now, it's predominantly age 11, 12, and the teenage years. On this graph it drops at age 17, but that's because they're referred to adult clinics at that age. But the sex and the age are not the only changes to the historic pattern. And in the Cass review, she referred to this, that this cohort of children now is a very, very vulnerable group. So this is what Dr. Hilary Cass said about this group. There is a greater complexity of presentation with high levels of neurodiversity, so lots of autistic kids, and or co-occurring mental health issues and a higher prevalence than in the general population of adverse childhood experiences and looked after children. This is what we see in all the studies, and again in every country, that these children are children who've experienced child sexual abuse or broken families, children in care, children with autism, and also children who would in the past have grown up to be gay. So there's huge changes in this group compared to what we saw historically with the children who were gender dysphoric. And so what's changed? Well, there has been a global transgender rights movement, and what they've promoted, the message they've promoted, is the idea of the transgender child. So in the past, we'd call a child a gender dysphoric child or a child with a cross-sex identity. And we would, but now we call that child the transgender child. It was the birth of the transgender child. So today's culture conceptualises a child who perhaps behaves more typically like the opposite sex as being trans, rather than in the past we might have said a girl who behaves more as boys do typically, we'd say that she was a tomboy. Now we're more likely to say, is she trans? So with the gender dysphoric child, or the child with a cross-sexual identity, we understood that child, that becoming transsexual was a potential outcome in adulthood, but we didn't call the child transgender. So the child's called transgender because of a new concept, and that's the concept of gender identity. Let's look at that. This is a slide, it's a graphic by an organisation called the Gender Identity Research and Education Society, or GIRES, who've been very active in influencing the NHS and the Tavistock Clinic. And this is their idea of gender identity, that a baby in the womb maybe looks like a boy but identifies as a girl, or looks like a girl but identifies as a boy. So the idea is that that every human being has a gender identity, and that it is the gender identity, that inner feeling or gendered soul, that is what makes you a boy or a girl or a man or a woman, not your biological sex. So it's a completely new way of understanding human beings. It has no basis in science. It's a new concept of how to understand human beings. So along with that change of concept has been a change of approach to children. So previously, children were treated with what was called watchful waiting, or a watch and wait approach. And that approach treated children as children. But that has changed along with this idea of gender identity. So watchful waiting has been replaced with a model called gender affirmation, or the gender affirmative model, which involves social transition of the child. And so I wanted to look at both of those approaches and ask the question, which approach is in the best interests of the child, and what does a school need to consider when looking at these two approaches, and what's the evidence behind each of them? What do we know about the watchful waiting approach, and what do we know about the gender affirmative approach, which is very, very new? So the watchful waiting approach is developmental, so it accepts that a child is on a developmental pathway, a child is a child, and a child is likely to change, let's say. A child is in a state of constant change because they're growing and developing. It may involve therapeutic help. It may involve family therapy, for example. It doesn't mean doing nothing. Because in the past we knew that a child who was strongly expressing a cross-sex identity, and a boy who was insisting that he was a girl, it could be for a number of reasons. Some reasons quite normal, so it's just a normal phase of childhood. Children get confused, or a boy who likes princesses and likes playing with Barbies might genuinely think he's a girl because of that and might be confused. He might be trying on different roles, and children like role play, so it might be a completely normal thing not to worry about. And the question then becomes how to help them feel comfortable and be accepted among their peers, etc., not be bullied. But it could be some problem. It could be a family dynamic involving that child, involving the other siblings, and the parents. It could be sexual abuse, which was a known reason for a child to want to change their sex. It was understood in childhood that it was a condition that it was understood on a childhood level. We have 12 studies of watchful waiting, children who were given this approach. And those studies show, looking at the results of all of them, that around 85% desist in those feelings or beliefs that they are of the opposite sex. So it really is, for the majority, a childhood phase. The most likely outcome for these children is becoming gay or lesbian as adults. You might even see it as quite a normal stage of childhood for some gay children, or children who would turn out to be gay. So the latest study of boys, which was in 2021, which is the largest study to date, showed 87.8% desisted and 63.6% grew up to be gay as adult men. So those are the kind of figures we get from all of these studies. Now that study is likely to be the last one that we have for children who were brought up, and this approach was used, which is a very neutral approach, because the approach now is right across the board gender affirmation instead. So the most common result was the resolution of gender dysphoria. It was to become gay as adults or to become heterosexual, but with a resolution and coming to terms with the sex that you were. The least likely outcome was transsexual. So that was a known fact in the past. With the gender affirmative approach, this means affirmation and social transition. So a boy is affirmed as a girl is affirmed as a boy. There's a full social role change, name and pronoun change, clothes, haircut, and sometimes a change of legal documents. The Cass Review called social transition an active intervention that may have significant effects on the child or young person in terms of their psychological functioning and longer term outcomes. And social transition is very recent. Again, over the past decade, children have started to be affirmed and socially transitioned. So these children have come into later studies that children arrive at the clinic already socially transitioned. And we know, from 2013, there was a study by a researcher called Thomas Steensma, who's from the Dutch clinic where puberty blockers were started. And that study was a study of persistence and desistance of these feelings of gender dysphoria. And the finding was that full social transition is the strongest predictor of persistence of cross-sex identity, which really makes sense when you think about it. If you're saying to a little boy, you are a girl, it's more likely that he will persist in those feelings. The Cass Review said that there's no clear evidence that social transition in childhood has any positive or negative affects mental health outcomes and relatively weak evidence for any effect in adolescence. However, those who had socially transitioned at an earlier age and or prior to being seen in a clinic were more likely to proceed to a medical pathway. So social transition is something that we know from referrals to the Tavistock that has really increased even over the last 5 years. And by comparison, the rate of desistance with children who are socially transitioned compared to that rate of desistance of 85% under watchful waiting is 6%. From the first study we have, the first large study we have of children who were socially transitioned from an early age. It's a study in the US by Christina Olsen. So you can see there are impacts of the gender affirmative approach and social transition. So, just to compare those two approaches, the watchful waiting approach is an established clinical approach, around 85% grow out of it. The majority grow up to be gay or lesbian. The gender affirmative approach is a new activist-led model. So this is a model that activists have promoted. It's not clinically developed from research or from medical knowledge, but it's come from lobbying by transgender activist groups. Around 6% desist, according to the first large-scale study we have. There's an increased likelihood of progression to medical intervention. So those are summing up the two approaches. So I think, when you look at those two approaches, which one is in the best interests of the child, I would say that the neutral watchful waiting approach, which treats children as children, and allows children to grow up and develop and change, is the better approach. And there's no evidence that watchful waiting approach ever caused harm to children. But it's been replaced for no good clinical reason or for reasons that are necessary because of harms caused. There was no harm from that approach. And a medical intervention is really quite serious. It means puberty blockers and then inevitably cross-sex hormones. And this was a judgment from a case where Kira Bell, who had medical treatment and regretted it, took the Tavistock to court. It was a judicial review, and we intervened in that review on behalf of Kira. And this is one of the findings of the judge, that in short, the treatment, which means puberty blockers, may be supporting the persistence of gender dysphoria in circumstances in which it is at least possible that without that treatment, the gender dysphoria would resolve itself. And I think that's a very significant judgment, that children do tend to grow up and those feelings resolve naturally throughout adolescence and into early adulthood. The published results of the Tavistock's first puberty blockers trial, started in 2011, showed that 98% of children who started on puberty blockers progressed to cross-sex hormones with irreversible lifetime effects. So the gender affirmative approach seems to me like an iatrogenic pathway to a lifetime as a medical patient, because those children never stop needing medical support. So social transition increases persistence. Persistence leads to puberty blockers. Puberty blockers make it more likely that you'll go on to cross-sex hormones. The vast majority do. And then potentially surgery. So on this pathway, children face a future of infertility, loss of adult sexual function, increased risk of serious health conditions, including cancers and heart disease, and that's apart from the known effects on bone density and cognitive impairment, which are implicated in studies on puberty blockers. But of course, we don't know everything about the long-term effects of puberty blockers given at the start of puberty, because this is such a new experiment on children. We don't know all the long-term results of it. So I would ask whether this approach is kind, because the approach of affirmation of children with a cross-sex identity is always presented to us as the only kind way. And if you don't affirm a child's gender identity, that's cruelty or it's bigotry. But I would question whether it's kind to encourage children onto this pathway that I think the vast majority of those children do not need to go on to and would not go on to if they weren't affirmed in the first place. It's very interesting that pathway is reflected in Jersey's own schools guidance. So this is the guidance. You probably can't read this, but I'll read it out to you. That it's a list of ways that the trans child can be supported in school. A name change, a change of pronoun, that means social transition, and wearing clothing associated with their gender identity. Use of toilets and changing rooms appropriate to the gender identity rather than their biological sex. So all of that is social transition. And then it goes on to medical transition is the process in which a trans person takes steps to physically change their body and may include taking puberty blockers, drugs that inhibit natural puberty, taking hormones to alter the secondary sex characteristics to align with the recognised gender, and or having gender reassignment surgery. So they've got it laid out in schools guidance, the pathway that we're putting children on starting in schools. And to me, that should not be part of schools guidance. This is not a pathway that is, it's a pathway that is harmful for children, that's going to cause all sorts of medical problems for them in the future, and those that regret the treatment cannot reverse it. There are aspects of that treatment that cannot be reversed, and some from puberty blockers, and also known results from cross-sex hormones. And I think that the way that this idea of being trans is promoted to children is with the idea that this is your authentic self. And this is the real you. And I don't think any child's authentic self needs to be medicalised. I think the message to children is your body is wrong, it needs medically fixing. And I think the message we should be giving children is the opposite to that. Your body is fine, your personality is fine, you're fine as you are. What you cannot change is whether you're a girl or a boy. So, the idea that it's kind is not supported by the evidence that what the activists, or trans activists and trans activist group tell us is that affirmation and puberty blockers are necessary for a child, because if we don't give that to the child, they're more likely to commit suicide. So there's never been any evidence to support that, but it's a terrible emotional manipulation of parents who would do anything to, stop their child from taking their own life. And of course it frightens people, it frightens teachers, it frightens everybody, the thought that a child might commit suicide if we don't affirm them. There's no evidence to support that, but from the results that were finally published in 2021 of the Tavistock's puberty blocker trial, didn't support that claim at all. Although the clinic itself claimed the results were good, a secondary analysis indicated that in terms of psychological outcomes, between 15 and 34% reliably deteriorate. 37 to 70% 70% experienced no reliable change in distress, and between 9 and 29 reliably improve. So that means the majority of these children will either not change, their mental health won't change, or it will get worse. And actually you'd expect, that's against a backdrop of normal adolescent problems, you'd expect to get better. Gradually mental health issues tend to get better. And also those rates of change are not good compared to typical child and adolescent mental health services, where recovery rates are found at around 50%. So it's not, the blockers are not a good, effective treatment, even on the basis of mental health. So I want to look now at what else has changed over the past few years to create this situation where we suddenly have lots of transgender children. And the unprecedented rise in referrals to the Tavistock correlates with the rise of social media, the internet, use of social media platforms, particularly by teenage girls. And in 2015, when I started this, the platforms pushing trans and trans identity were Tumblr, Reddit and YouTube. This is now more TikTok, Instagram, still YouTube, still Reddit. Around 2018, the referrals to the Tavistock began to plateau, but after lockdown, I think that stopped a lot of things, they shot up again as a lot of mental health issues did for children. And this actually supports the social contagion theory. Lockdown anxiety has been widely reported, along with an increase in general mental health problems, and this fits that pattern. And I don't know if you remember, there was an outbreak of TikTok tics in teenage girls during lockdown. Does anybody remember that report? There was reported actually all over the world. There were outbreaks of TikTok tics, as it was called. And it was recognised as a result of social influences. And as with gender dysphoria, Tourette's itself typically begins in childhood and affects predominantly boys. But in the case of this outbreak during lockdown, it affected mainly teenage girls. And those teenage girls also had mental health issues. But this ties in with, historically, social contagions generally affect teenage girls more than any other group. So it was reported about the tics and the Tourette's that girls developed, that the girls gained peer support and approval and recognition and sense of belonging from having tics. But they also, a significant number were also having, they were engaging in self-harm and had mental health problems. But, which again is concordant with the girls who are experiencing gender dysphoria and announcing a trans identity. But it's interesting to me that I think the cohort today that are saying they're trans fit far more closely this model of social contagion than they do the historic group of children who were little boys, who were generally pre-gay or just very effeminate little boys. I don't think there's much in common with the group today who are, and I think there are a lot of boys, also adolescent boys, who fit that pattern of developing gender dysphoria after puberty. Along with girls, it's a kind of social contagion among boys as well, just not so many as the girls. But particularly the boys who are autistic or on the autism spectrum. So this rise in referrals, it also correlates with the introduction and the real explosion of trans materials in schools. So this is it's an adult. Right, it's an adult rights movement, really. It's a social justice movement, but I've never known another adult social justice movement that's targeted children, and targeted children so aggressively. And this started coming into schools 10 years ago, but it's really exploded over the past 5 years. And This is just an example that there are badges, posters, books, projects, pride celebrations, which are always about trans now. Pride doesn't seem to be about gay people anymore. And this is the graphic that is very common in schools. It's common in even primary schools. And it teaches children that they have a gender identity, and that's fact. And a gender identity is a sense of womanliness or manness. They also have a gender expression which can be feminine or masculine. And the biological sex is described as a state of femaleness or maleness. And what you notice here is that nothing is real, nothing is concrete. Male and female are not concrete biological realities, but they're concepts, they're subjective qualities of femaleness and maleness. This really is queer theory for children, which is another part of the picture that came down from academia. And queer theory says that there is no real reality until human beings named it. So biological sex isn't real, it's something that we invented. Although they seem to think that gender identity is real, although that has no scientific basis. This is another graphic. This was from a group called Mermaids. And this is what children are being taught, and it's why I think so many children now are identifying as non-binary. This is the gender identity spectrum. And children are taught that you're either transgender or cisgender. If you're a girl and you're a cisgender girl, you are a Barbie. If you're a boy and you're a cisgender boy, you're G.I. Joe. So a boy and girl, those words have been redefined as the most extreme gender stereotypes. And if a girl is not particularly feminine, she's encouraged to think that she's further along this gender identity spectrum. And if a boy is quite sensitive and likes poetry and art and doesn't really like rough play, that he's not really a boy, that he's more likely to be genderqueer or gender fluid or non-binary or all these other newly invented terms. It's just not cool to be cisgender. You know, what self-respecting teenager would want to be cisgender? So children are sort of told that they really must identify into some gender identity. And every gender identity, this is just only 6 of hundreds, every gender identity has its flag, and this one really amuses me. It's from a top girls' school, private girls' school in London. And can anybody spot the difference with the flag for the cisgender child? Would anybody like to put their hands up and say what it is? It's just grey. It's got no colour. You can be genderqueer, gender fluid, non-binary, transgender, you know, and all sorts of other gender identities, all with your own flag, all to be celebrated. But cisgender, you're just grey. It's fantastic, isn't it? I love that. It's in sex education. So this is a book, and I want to show you how common this is, because this is a book published by Collins. It's a book that is part of a whole school PSHE curriculum. Very respected publisher, Your Choice, book 3. Perhaps can't read that. What does it say? Some people want to change their gender through surgery or hormone treatment. And this is how these books are presenting this, as if this is the same as changing your outfit or changing your hairstyle. It teaches children trans women are women and trans men are men. It teaches children how to support a trans friend, which is to affirm them and believe them. And now this indoctrination, because it's a definition of indoctrination where you're presenting an idea as a fact. So there isn't any scientific basis for this idea. It is an ideology, it's a new ideology. It's presented to children as fact. So this indoctrination, it's passed down to the very youngest children. So this is just a selection of books on this slide. We've counted over 60 picture books for the early years and primary age children. If you look very closely at these books, you'll see illustrated there 2 figures with double mastectomy scars. If you look hard enough, you'll also see, and this is on the pronoun book, this is increasingly depicted, a person in a wheelchair. And when you see actually groups of trans people now, this is more and more common that you see people in wheelchairs and with sticks, and that's probably the bone density issue where young people are getting bone fractures because they've got the bone density of an elderly person. So this also is what, there's some more double mastectomy. Did anybody spot them in the last one? It's bodies are cool, it's the double mastectomy scars. Next to that is a book called Grandad's Pride, and the figure is holding out a sign saying out and proud with double mastectomy scars. This seems to be really, really pushed. It's almost become a badge of honour or something cool. There it is again in a book that's in school libraries, a very popular book called Welcome to St. Hell. And you can see from the illustration there, again, who'd want to be that weak, pathetic looking girl when you could be that really cool boy with the really cool double mastectomy scars? You can see how this appeals to teenagers, unfortunately. And there we have again, this is Homebody, and this is about, one day I will call this house a home. This is about a child who changes their body through hormones and surgery. And all of these books present this idea, promote this idea that medical intervention is just normal. This is the message from a book called Jamie, which is, Jamie's a non-binary 11-year-old. And this book teaches primary age children, transgender kids can also have puberty blockers to stop them going through the wrong kind of puberty for their true gender. So all of this teaching ends up with medical treatment. It starts now very often in schools, and it's what's known as a school to clinic pipeline. So I would raise very really serious safeguarding concerns about the school's guidance that promotes this. And I'll finish with just another slide from the government schools guidance. And this bit is about confidentiality. And I think this sums up the kind of school that you're creating when you base policies on gender identity and gender affirmation rather than basing policies on reality and the reality of biological sex. It says a child or adult has the right to keep private their trans status at school, and information about a child's trans status, legal name or gender assigned at birth may constitute medical and confidential sensitive personal data. And in fact, under Jersey law, the data, knowing somebody's sex is critical for safeguarding. And this kind of schools guidance, this is happening all over the world, right throughout Europe, through, it's happening globally. And every country has its different equality laws. But what I always say to people, whatever you understand about your own country's equality laws, safeguarding overrides legal requirements. You have to safeguard first when you're talking about children. And you cannot safeguard children if you're hiding some people's sex from them, or you're pretending that a child of one sex is the other sex. It's an immediate safeguarding issue when facilities become mixed sex. It says here that staff should not disclose information even to parents. So again, that's a huge safeguarding issue because parents should be involved, and all safeguarding guidance will say this, that parents need to be involved in the safeguarding of their own children and know what's happening to them in school and how they're treated. So if a school makes a decision to socially transition a child, they cannot withhold that information from parents. So I would say that this is a serious issue that's going into schools. It's putting teachers in a really, really difficult position because if you disagree with it, there's a real risk that you'll be called a bigot and transphobic like everybody is. And teachers should not be put in this position where I think they are being put at professional risk by having to deal with these issues. So I would say that if your parents, if your grandparents, write to the government, write to MPs, write to the schools, and express your opposition or ask questions and express your concerns with this guidance going into schools. And I think Women's Rights Network in Jersey can help you do that. Thank you.